Testing, testing, microphone. One, two, three.
Oh, perfect. I'm going to sit down for a second.
Okay, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to today's lecture, which forms part of the NTU Distinguished Lectures in the Humanities series. So this is a series that invites some of the most eminent thinkers, writers, and intellectuals from around the world to share their insights on a wide range of topics across and between the humanities disciplines. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick practical note. So this is a hybrid lecture, so we have audience members both here in the auditorium in person and online. So we're going to have questions at the end. When we have the question period, for the online audience members, we'll have a QR code or a web link that you can go to type your questions into Slido. So those questions will then be visible on screen in the lecture theatre. For those of you who are here in the auditorium, you can use Slido if you prefer, or you can raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. So that's the practicalities, and I can remind you of that at the end if necessary. We'll have the QR code up on screen. So today I am delighted to introduce Professor Ronald Schleifer, who is the George Lynn Cross Research Professor of English and Adjunct Professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Oklahoma. Professor Schleifer has been visiting NTU for more than 10 years, and we're delighted that he continues to choose to come back and share his work with us. Professor Schleifer's work focuses on 20th century literature and medicine, as well as critical theory. He's a prolific scholar, having written, translated, or edited 22 books and over 100 articles or book chapters. Over the length of his career, he pursued a long-term study of the culture of modernism, starting with Modernism and Time, published by Cambridge University Press in the year 2000, which analyzed the transition from Enlightenment to post-Enlightenment ways of understanding in Western thought. In 2011, his Modernism and Popular Music questioned distinctions between high art and popular art through close examination of literature, jazz, and the new technologies of radio and the phonograph. In 2018, A Political Economy of Modernism expanded his study of modernist cultures by bringing literature and the arts into conversation with post-classical economics and the institutional structures of capitalism. Most recently, he's turned his focus beyond the Western world, co-authoring Modernist Poetics in China, Consumerist Economics, and Chinese Literary Modernism with Tia Wang, who is also here with us today. His most recent book, published about a year ago, is Literary Studies and Well-Being, Structures of Experience in the Worldly Work of Literature and Healthcare, which examines what the practical pursuit of well-being in healthcare reveals about our engagement with and understanding of literature. He's also co-authored numerous books in the medical humanities. And as well as publishing his own scholarship, he has served the field as an editor for journals and book series, and as a teacher of scholarly writing and mentor to graduate students and junior faculty, as those of you who attended this morning's workshop can attest. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Schleifer as he talks to us today about the haptic arts, the aesthetics of worldliness. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? It's a pleasure to be back. It's been how many years since I've been here, Catherine? Yeah. Every time I come here, I go home smarter, and that's why I keep coming back. It's one of my cherished professional pleasures. So I'm delighted to be back again, and today I'm going to talk about the haptic arts and the aesthetics of worldliness. Let me begin, though, by whispering in your ear. Here's the first beginning. There I am, there you are. Today I want to talk about what I'm calling the haptic arts, aesthetic forms that are notably worldly, by which I mean art forms that do not pursue the disinterestedness which Immanuel Kant described as a defining characteristic of aesthetic experience. Rather, worldly arts, among which I include sports and gymnastics, which I take to be species of dance and ballet widely conceived, the art of gastronomy, which achieves its end not only in eating, but in the ways that presentation contributes to our experience of eating, and even more traditional art forms, music, narrative, pictorial, and plastic arts, which are conceived as embedded in worldly concerns and actions. In delineating what I'm calling the haptic arts, I'm particularly interested in the role of gesture in our social and communicative lives. And among other examples, I hope to touch upon what is described in physiological analyses as lip gestures, and musicology as musical gestures, and even in evolutionary studies of human language and consciousness as communicative gestures more generally. There's a parallel here by which I wish to orient my discussion. Gesture is necessarily interested. It participates in worldly business of one sort or another, by which I mean evolutionary adaptive functions that enhance the success of particular species, even as abstract, that's to say disinterested notions of sensibility, work to widen the experience rather than achieve survival advantages. The opposition between interest and disinterest parallels the opposition between what speech act theory describes between the performative and constitutive language in speech act theory. Language conceived as creating social relations as opposed to language conceived as conveying information, which can be understood as true or false without regards to the worldly interests of the sender. I find a fine example of this opposition in Robert Kaplan's intellectual history of mathematics entitled A Natural History of Zero. In his book, Kaplan writes, in the course of history, numbers were becoming invisible, no longer descriptive of objects, but objects, that's to say rarefied objects themselves. 3 was once like small. It could modify shoes and ships or sealing wax. Now it had detached itself so far from the rabble of things that instead those ephemera participated briefly in its permanence. In my recent book, Literary Studies and Well-Being, I cite this passage to note that what is most striking in Kaplan's account in the context of my discussion of the place of modifiers in speech act theory, and particularly adverbs, is a transformation of numbers functioning like modifiers, like small, into numbers processing positive constant existence as nouns. Equally striking, I conclude, is the erasure of both worldliness and experience from knowledge. Note the opposition between nouns designating idea concepts of phenomena and adverbs designating the qualities of action also parallel disinterested art and communication and worldly art and communication I'm setting forth here by way of introduction. For most of my professional life, studying the aesthetics of literary and narrative art in the context of particular literary texts, particular historical moments, and in healthcare clinics, I have assumed that the modalities of aesthetics were predominantly, and in fact I often thought exclusively, focused on modalities of sight and sound. I made this assumption perhaps because the literary studies in which I was trained seemed to focus upon images and sound patterns, as did Ludwig Wittgenstein in his focus on auditory images and visual images, which I note in literary studies and well-being. Or perhaps because Roman Jakobson emphasizes sight and sound in his important essay, Linguistics and Poetics. Or perhaps because we have music and the plastic arts engaged with sound and sight, even when the phenomena of dance and gesture, and even gastronomy, most often lend themselves to psychological or physiological rather than aesthetic analysis. I'm sorry. As I was saying, for most of my career, I have focused on sight and sound. But lately, in part perhaps because of the hands-on activities in the healthcare clinic, which I discussed this morning, or yesterday, I guess, in the medical school here in Singapore, and perhaps because more and more I have understood speech act theory to be the site of worldly action, in any case, I've lately increasingly thought about touching as a third modality of engagement, along with sight and sound. Such a focus on touching, I've come to think, falls under the category of haptic arts, which would, importantly, more fully comprehend aesthetic experiences as worldly, beyond Kant's notion of disinterested art. The word haptic is an adjective derived from the Greek haptikos, to describe touching. Here's the definition. Ancient Greek haptikos, able to come in contact with, from haptos, to touch, and ekos, suffix forming an adjective form. The Greek term and the English adjective also suggest our English concept of grasping. Grasping is one of our first human gestures. Grasping newborn humans situate themselves within the world by means of what the neurologist Merlin Donald has called primitive hand control spinal cord pathway from a very ancient ancestor called the preperal spinal tract, which controls primitive finger movements. But of course, grasping is a quick and almost universal figure that neatly offers a metaphor for understanding. After all, we grasp ideas. Think of Michelangelo's image in which he imagines God touching Adam into life. In this, we can discern a full-blown haptic image and event. In Isaac Denison's story, The Poet, a story I return to later in this presentation, young Francine, a ballet dancer, encounters the story's poet, a young man named Anders Koob. Here it is on the screen. In the clear and sweet evening air, we're told, she felt her own body strong and light as a young birch tree, her slim waist pliant as a branch, her young breasts resting lightly, like a part of smooth, round eggs in the nest of warm and fresh lawn. Her flaming gaze was so deeply sunk in his, and his in hers, that it would take a powerful crane to lift them apart again. She lifted her hand just a little and held it towards him, slowly, as if it had been a heavy weight. He stretched out his hand and touched her fingertip. It was exactly the gesture of the creator of Michelangelo, transmitting divine life to the young Adam. Not only is Francine's gesture, like that of Michelangelo, a haptic event, a moment of touching, but even Denison's narrative description, which both indicates and works to erase the opposition between human body and natural landscape, the here and there, I'm arguing, of haptics altogether, is a worldly moment of touching. So let me start with the preamble, semiotics and the catalog of experiential modalities. Before I turn to the haptic arts themselves, I want to develop, following the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, a systematic understanding of our interactions with the world. Peirce, a notable philosopher and logician, seemed to have coined the scientific term semiotics in the late 19th century. Semiotics is the systematic study of how communicative signs give rise to meaning. I say seem to have coined the term because John Locke, I believe unknown to Peirce, coined the term semiotics in the late 17th century. More notably, I believe, is the remarkable fact that the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure called for a science of semiotics in his course in general linguistics in Paris almost at the very same time Peirce did so in America. As I've argued elsewhere, this seeming coincidence nicely parallels the introduction of the calculus into mathematics by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz in the late 17th century. Just as Enlightenment science needed the calculus, invented by two mathematicians whose innovations were unknown to one another, so I've argued the consumerist culture of the late 19th century needed a science of signs articulated at the same time by two people unknown to one another. In my book, Intangible Materialism, and also in my new project I'm introducing in this presentation, I focus on the interaction of hand and brain as a function of the social nature of human beings and of other primates as well. I touch upon a fine-grained study by Frank Wilson entitled The Hand, How Its Use Shapes the Brain, Language, and Human Culture. In this study, he describes the sense of becoming one with objects in the world, which I imagine we all have experienced in our sports, our musical play, our shaping pottery, or simply finger painting, and even as we become one, so to speak, with those whom we physically touch. Surely this is the import of the passage from Denison's story I have cited. The idea of becoming one with a backhoe, Wilson writes, is no more exotic than the idea of a rider becoming one with a horse or a carpenter becoming one with a hammer. And this phenomenon itself may take its origin from the countless monkeys who spent countless eons becoming one with tree branches. The mystical feel comes from the combination of a good mechanical marriage and something in the nervous system that can make an object external to the body seem as if it had sprouted from the hand, foot, or rarely some other place on the body where your skin makes contact with it. And I'll come back to the nervous system later. Part of this feeling of contact, of becoming one, is the sense we feel that our hands know. They know the grip of book or a tool. In the Cyborg, knowing Catherine Hales describes where a blind man's cane extends his body out into the world of things. And they also respond to the consciousness of other minds, other feelings. So here's Peirce's signs. In Peirce's semiotics, he posits that three modalities of sign function. He designates them as icons, indexes, and symbols, delineate three modalities of interaction and engagement with the world. My view, he wrote early in his career, is that there are three modes of being, and I hold that we can directly observe them in elements of whatever is at any time before the mind in any way. They are the being of positive qualitative possibility, the being of actual fact, and the being of law that will govern the future. The qualitative possibility he describes is the sheer sensation of phenomena, the redness of experience before it's associated with an object or a meaning, the force or dynamism of a sound sensation. The icon, he says, quotes, excites analogous sensations in the mind. It is such sound sensations with which Pavlov trained dogs to salivate. And we'll get back to dogs too. The being of actual fact is apprehended by the indexical or indicative nature of signs, the fact that signs point or refer to objects in the world. No matter of fact, he writes, can be stated without the use of some sign serving as an index. An index, he says, stands, quote, unequivocally for this or that existing thing. Peirce explains the modality of symbolism as the law that will govern the future. For Peirce, a symbol is a sign which refers to the object that it denotes by virtue of a law, usually an association of general ideas which operates to cause the symbol to be interpreted as referring to that object. Let's look at Peirce's index more closely, since his index, as I hope this suggests, is closely tied to haptic events, the work of the hand. No matter of fact, he writes, can be stated without the use of some sign serving as an index. If A says to B, there is a fire, B will ask, where? Thereupon A is forced to resort to an index, even if he only means somewhere in the real universe, past and future. Otherwise, he has only said that there is such an idea as fire, which would give no information, since unless it were known already, the word fire would be unintelligible. If A points his finger to the fire, his finger is dynamically connected with the fire, as much as if a self-acting fire alarm had directly turned in that direction. If A's reply is within 1,000 yards of here, the word here is an index, for it has precisely the same force as if he had pointed energetically to the ground between him and B. There seems to be something inherent or natural to Peirce's indexicality of pointing. As Susan Golden Meadow notes, quote, even before young children produce pointing gestures to orient another's attention towards an object, they respond to others' pointing gestures as directing their attention to the object indicated by the point, unlike our dog Kugel, she adds, who insists on looking at the end of my finger when I point out a toy to her. In Peirce's account of some sign serving as an index, he is offering gestures that situate communication, and I'm suggesting situate attention and consciousness. Moreover, it situates communication and attention in relation to action, which is to say, in relation to both worldliness and narrative. Thus, Anne Friedman notes that Peirce's index accomplishes, quote, the relation of knowledge and action, made, taken, or simply used as given, indices or devices for interpreting a bit of the world in such a way as to guide action. Some are devices for establishing the conditions of communication, others for using communication to some particular effect, and still others for converting experience into the data for theory. Proprioception, exteroception, and interoception. I'm not sure those are my favorite words, but let me begin. As I mentioned earlier, lately I've become interested in touch as well as seeing and hearing, not only in understanding literature and literary narrative, but in understanding any worldly sense of well-being and happiness. In this, to be technical for a moment, I've become interested in what neuroscience describes as the phenomenon of proprioception. I think I have it here. Which records our sense of place in the world as well as taking in the world itself. That is, proprioception describes the interaction, the perception/sensation of body and world taken together, and it discovers its place in another catalog of the magical number 3, along with exteroception, the perception, sensation, of phenomena in the world, which includes the sensation, for instance, of sight, and interoception, the perception, sensation of our bodies themselves, such as a stomachache. Let me say a word for a moment. I just mentioned the magic number 3. In A Guess at the Riddle, which aimed to introduce a magnus opus he never wrote, Peirce begins by noting how, quote, much use the threefold division he makes in his speculations. Those 3 include the sign functions I've mentioned, icon, index, symbol. They include deduction, induction, abduction, which I talked about in my medical school lecture, and what he calls the abstract notions of firstness, secondness, thirdness. The first is agent, he says, the second patient, the third is the action by which the former influences the latter. I could add another number 3 modes of definition, which include exemplary definition, iconically pointing something else, Aristotelian genus-species definition, symbolically predicting the future, and operational definition, indexically seeing how something works. The notion of operational definition is a late one. It comes about after Einstein. Interoception, I contend, might well include our apprehension of melody and harmony, rather than the simple sound sensations that stimulate salivation in Pavlov's dogs. It is notable that while dogs salivate when they hear a sound such as the note E natural, when E natural is part of a melody, for instance, in a D major version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, in which E natural appears as a passing tone, leading to the final D natural, when this occurs, dogs do not respond with the conditioned response. By the way, the dog in this picture is my dog Louie, and he's a honey. Now I've lost my track. If this is so, then perhaps there's more to musical sound sensations than simply exteroceptive stimuli. But of course, this should make sense insofar as it is Peirce's argument that his 3 categories of signs, icon, index, symbol, are not exclusive, but as he says, quote, elements of whatever is at any time before the mind in any way. That is, there is an element of indexicality in everything that is before the mind in any way. And that element of indexicality might well help us understand the function and power of harmony in music, the plastic arts, and the literary arts, as well as the more apparently hands-on arts of dance, gymnastics, and the actual or imagined feel of sculpture. Let me pursue this a bit further. In his book, Paper Minds, a study of literature in relation to what he calls the ecology of consciousness, Jonathan Kramnik adds idea of touch to those of sight and sound. When we handle or bump into something, he writes, we form ideas of touch, whereas when we view something, we form ideas of sight. And when we perceive the distance between one thing and another, and so experience the world in 3 dimensions, we calculate unawares the distance of each from our hands. Touching leads to more obviously to what I describe as inferential engagements with the world in literary studies and well-being, than do the seeming immediate sensations of sight or sound, insofar as touching makes the interactions of engagement explicit and demands the calculation Kramnik mentions, and I'll mention emotion in a moment. Such calculating interactions with the world seem somewhat implicit when we look and listen. The Impressionistic arts in the late 19th century emphasized what art historians call the active absorption of aesthetic engagements. Thus, the art historian Daniel Hurwitz suggests that, quote, I think this is on the screen, suggests that the Impressionist painting was a breakthrough in form, insofar as it composed its images out of tiny brushstrokes that the viewer must visually and actively complete, and that placed the viewer in a state of active absorption. But beyond the seeming disinterested aesthetics, touching, as I noted earlier, emphasizes social and worldly engagements more than the apparent passivity of seeing and hearing. Thus, proprioception seems more calculating, to use the term Kramnik takes up from the 18th century philosopher George Berkeley, than the seeming immediacy of vision and hearing. But what more precisely is going on with these dogs, and particularly the dog on the slide, my dog Louie? What's going on with the music they listen to but apparently don't hear? In his wonderful neurological account of music, entitled Musicophilia, Oliver Sacks presents a thought-provoking definition of music. This too's on the screen. Hearing a melody, he writes, is hearing, having heard, and being about to hear all at once. Again, Sacks is participating in the magical number 3. Hearing is icon sensation. Having heard is an index, a matter of worldly fact. Being about to hear is the symbolic law that will govern the future. And Sacks all at once gathers together Peirce's elements as elements of everyday engagement with the world. It seems to me that our experience with music, but with painting, dance, and above all, the apprehension of what linguists call the meaningful whole of narrative discourse, all this is based upon an ability to infer possible meanings, the law that will govern the future, by means of apprehending and grasping inferences following from experience writ large, the grasping all at once of iconic sensation, indexical fact, and symbolic signification. Such inference, again more precisely, is based upon what scholars call tacit disciplinary knowledge, which can be heard in disciplinary trained vocabularies, such as we find in formal intellectual disciplines, such as healthcare studies, literary studies, and even sociology. I say even sociology because my son studies sociology. Such experience, I've argued, is not immediate, even if it feels to be so. Rather, it is mediated by tacit disciplinary knowledge, which by definition is a proprioceptive engagement with our situation and marks our relationship, as Peirce's index does, to the world. The symbolic meanings of apprehended experiences are necessarily proprioceptive and indexical. They are necessarily worldly. If one knows a system of tonic-based music, absent, alas, in my dog Louie's engagement with the world, if one knows the systematics of biomedical diagnosis, of semiotic narrative organizations of events, of complementary colors and painterly organizations of the world. Under these circumstances, experiencing, having experienced, and being about to experience roll up together in a sense of wholeness. It might well be that Louis shares icon and index in his tacit knowledge of smell, which seems to govern his engagements with the world far beyond what I can even imagine, even if he lacks the complexities of our symbols. I have a strong suspicion that in his emotional engagements with the world, like our own, he possesses rudiments of proprioceptive law that will govern the future. In my medical school talk, I discussed the ways that Peirce links emotions. His example, like mine, are emotions associated with the harmonies and melodies of music. He links them to inferential thinking in the clinic. So now at last the haptic arts. Let me begin with ballet. Let me begin with the art of human movement, namely ballet. In her story, The Poet, Isak Dinesen offers a wonderful account of Francine, whom we have already met, dancing for herself in, quote, that hour just before sunrise when the world seems absolutely colorless. The counselor Marthason, who is close to 60 years old and a major figure in the town of Hirschholm in the early 19th century, comes upon her dancing because of a carriage accident late at night. He has made himself the sponsor and mentor of Anders Kub, the young poet I mentioned earlier, and recently he has decided to propose marriage to Francine. Francine is a young widow, probably half the counselor's age. We have already noticed in the scene I presented earlier, which takes place after this moment I'm describing now, we've already seen that Francine and Anders have come to love one another, in a love signified by the touching of their hands. After the accident with his carriage, the counselor comes up to Francine's house, and hidden behind a window, he sees her dancing by herself in the garden room of the small mansion she inherited from her late elderly husband. And here's the passage. The young mistress of the house stood on the tips of her toes in the middle of the room. She had on the very short diaphanous frock of a ballet dancer, and her little heedless shoes were fastened with black ribbons laced around her delicate ankles and legs. She held her arms over her head, gracefully rounded, and stood quite still, watching the music, her face like the placid, happy face of a doll. As her bar of music fell in, she suddenly came to life. She lifted her right leg slowly, the toe pointing straight at the counselor, higher and higher, as if she were really rising from the ground, about to fly. Then she brought it down again, slowly, on the tip of her toe, like a little gentle pat, no more than a finger tap upon the table. The spectator outside held his breath. As before, on watching the ballet at Vienna, he had the feeling that this was too much. It could not be done. And then it was done, lightly, as in jest. One begins to doubt the fall of man and not to worry about it when a young dancer can thus rise from it again. Standing upon the tip of her right toe now, she lifted her leg slowly, high up, opened her arms in a swift, audacious movement, whirled all around herself, and began to dance. The dance was more than the real mazurka, very fiery and light, lasting perhaps 2 minutes. A humming top, a flower, a flame dancing, a play upon the law of gravitation, a piece of celestial drollery. It was also a bit of acting. Love, sweet innocence, tears, a sursum cordae expressed in music and movement. Sursum cordae, Latin for lift up your hearts, is the opening dialogue of the most solemn part of the Eucharistic liturgies, a thanksgiving prayer when bread and wine are consecrated as the body and blood of Christ. Such consecration, the reaching of our body and blood to spirit and life, is nicely captured in Michelangelo's haptic image of the creation of human life altogether. Dinesen too sets forth a haptic image. The dance comes to life with the dancer watching music, which Isak says is about to be heard, so that her body can be felt to be really rising from the ground, about to fly, bread and body becoming spirit. The haptic art, which, without leaving the earth, plays with gravitation and doesn't do away with original fallen sin, but renders it something not to worry about, a flaming dancing, is the aesthetic theatrics of acting. Love, sweet innocence, tears, sursum cordae, inhabiting music and movement in our very world. Recently, I encountered a wonderful definition of mimesis in a study of Aristotle's Poetics entitled The Poetry of Philosophy. In this study, Michael Davis creates a notable sense of what I've recently called, quote, an economy of mimetic imitation, which transforms rather than represents reality. Davis captures this transformation in his observation that, quote, at first glance, mimesis seems to be a stylizing of reality in which the ordinary features of our world are brought into focus by a certain exaggeration. The relationship's somewhat like the relationship of dancing to walking. Such bringing into focus of the features of our world is the work of haptic art. Most notably, I think, such art takes its place in jest, and particularly in jokes. After all, few things are more haptic than joking, almost always a narrative which provokes bodily response. Davis's sense of mimesis, his sense of mimetic dance, comes close to what I am calling the particular haptic art of caricature, which brings jest to the world and particularly to pomposity. Surely Francine's imitation of flying can be grasped with her legs so high, toe barely touching the earth, human rendered as doll, as a caricature of human walking. So I'll speak for just a short moment about caricature and gastronomy. Had I had time, I'd turn to E.M. Gombrich's wonderful analysis of the 1831 caricature of Louis Philippe, France's bourgeois king, the king who shouldn't be confused with my dog, Louis. In Art and Illusion, Gombrich notes that caricature, quote, rests on the plea of equivalence. And indeed, we feel that despite change of each individual feature in these images, the whole remains remarkably similar. We accept it as a possible alternative mode of seeing the king's face. Gombrich goes on to argue that, quote, caricature becomes only a special case of what I have attempted to describe as the artist's test of success. All artistic discoveries are discoveries not of likenesses, but of equivalences, which enable us to see reality in terms of an image and an image in terms of reality. Such equivalence, I'm suggesting, emphasizes the worldliness of art, which does not leave the world behind, but touches the world, so to speak, with its toe, and perhaps, like Michelangelo, touches the world into life. Similarly, in her wonderful story and a wonderful movie, if you've ever seen it, Babette's Feast, Tennyson sets forth the art of gastronomy. After the fabulous meal that Babette prepares, quote, none of the guests later on had any clear remembrance of it. They only knew that the rooms had been filled with a heavenly light, and that taciturn old people received the gift of tongues. Ears that for years had been almost deaf were open to it. Time itself merged into eternity. Here again, there's a worldly equivalence in which mimetic rather than representational transforms silence into speech and into the harmony of hearing, having heard, and being about to hear, the equivalence of time and eternity. But now let me say a word about haptic music. So instead of caricature and eating, those clearly worldly activities, let me turn to music and then to ekphrastic poetry, taking in painting, but also in ancient Greece, the skill of describing worldly objects with vivid detail. But music first. In a powerfully engaging novel about a hostage takeover in South American home entitled Bel Canto, Anne Patchett begins with a moment after a famous opera diva sings to the assembled guests of international businessmen and women and local politicians. At that moment, the soprano, Roxanne Cross in the novel, finishes. At the moment she finishes, all the lights of the house go out. And in the dark, everyone there is certain that the accompanist kissed the singer, even though no one saw or could have seen what had happened. They were so taken by the beauty of her voice, Patchett notes in the opening pages of the novel, that they wanted to cover her mouth with their mouth, drink in. Maybe music could be transferred, devoured, owned. What would it mean to kiss the lips that had held such sound? Later in the novel, Patchett presents the figure of a poor priest listening to the soprano. Here it is. It was different in ways the poor priest never could have imagined, as if the voice were something that could be seen. Certainly it could be felt, even where he stood in the very back of the room. It trembled inside the folds of his cassock, brushed against the skin of his cheeks. Never had he thought, never once, that such a woman existed, one who stood so close to God that God's own voice poured from her. How far she must have gone inside herself to call up that voice. It was as if the voice came from the center part of the earth. Effort and diligence of her will, she had pulled it up through the dirt and rock and through the floorboards of the house, up into her feet, where it pulled through her, reaching, lifting, warmed by her, and then out of the white lily of her throat and straight to God in heaven. It was a miracle, and he wept for the gift of bearing witness. Here Patchett gives us a sense of what Dennison might have meant by representing Francine watching the music. Watching the music she dances, making music, in both cases, a worldly thing. But it is the feeling of the music, trembling in his cassock, touching his cheeks, so that the priest knows that Roxanne is touched with, quote, God's own voice, as if the voice came from the center part of the earth, up into her feet. Is it through her toes again, I might ask? Where it pulls through her. The priest's thanksgiving, his sursum cordi, tears, and theatricalized mimetic love offers an aesthetics of worldliness I'm describing in today's talk. The music iconically presents itself, indexically locates the priest in connection with the center of the earth, the house, and his floorboard, music felt in his cassock, touching his very cheek. In these two scenes of music, Patchett emphasizes voice, but I'd argue it is harmony and melody embodied in voice that touches and locates its listeners. That is, haptic-like, the human body apprehends itself to be, as Wilson says, one with the world it engages. Thus, in Wilson's words, in engagement with the melodies and harmonies of music, a person engages, as Wilson says, quote, an object external to the body, including, I'm arguing here, object sensations of sound, in such a way that sound itself, its harmonies and melodies, feel to be one with the world. And the harmonies and melodies of sound, again in Wilson's words, quote, feel as if they had sprouted from the hand, the foot, or rarely some other place on the body where your skin makes contact with it. This, I suspect, is the haptic experience and action of Patchett's Poor Priest and Patchett's rich music. Let me turn to ekphrastic poetry. As I mentioned earlier, ekphrastic poetry is poetry that takes its occasion for speech from an encounter with a particular painting, and as such allows me to example the haptics of the visual arts. But also in ancient Greece, ekphrastic poetry designates the skill of describing worldly objects with vivid detail. We've seen such vivid detail in the description of Francine's body as, quote, strong and light as a young birch tree, her slim waist pliant as a branch. Here, though, I want to focus on W.H. Auden's poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts, that meditates on a pre-modern Dutch painting by Peter Bruegel entitled Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, painted in the 1560s, and it also touches upon two other Bruegel paintings depicting wintertime skating and Christian martyrdom, which are alluded to in the poem. But here's the poem. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or just walking dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in the corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expansive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to, and sailed calmly on. Before I direct our attention to this poem, let me return to my discussion of vision as a modality of art and engagement. In the defense of judgment, Michael Clune argues that, quote, vision tends to provide me with a very distinct sense of my location with respect to the objects of the vision. Whether or not this is true of vision in general, and in the context of pre-modern and even modernist art forms, I will suggest it is probably not. It's probably not true in general. Nevertheless, it is certainly true of the vision of perspectival painting that developed in the Western Renaissance. Perspectival painting organizes itself to situate the viewer at a particular location in space. In her brilliant analysis of realism in fiction and in art, Elizabeth Ermarth describes the ways that perspective distorts, so to speak, the surface of things. Let me give you a picture. Distorts the surface of things in Raphael's The School of Athens. Here's an image of the Raphael painting. She goes on to say, spectators of this painting, she notes, did not explicitly see the blocks in the parquet floor as squares, as they might be in medieval or Chinese painting. The squares are represented in one aspect only, and so have a trapezoid visual form. The squares cannot be seen directly, except from some improbable position in the air. The squareness of the sections, which is their identity, can only be gathered from a series of implied viewpoints and can be fully grasped only as an abstraction from immediate experience. Such abstraction, like the abstract number 3 with which I began, is something outside worldliness and experience. Perspectival art that makes Clune's notion of location itself the abstraction of some improbable position in the air, abandons, Ermarth says, Western pre-modern attempts to save the appearances, to account for what is seen, in order, as she says, to save the essences, the true reality underlying surface perceptions. And here's her argument. When time and space, she argues, are conceived as homogeneous, that is, the same universally, then it becomes possible to chart both the differences and similarities in nature which give rise to those generalizations in science and art that we call laws. In formulating such laws, no attempt is made to save the appearances. In fact, we might say that in reducing the welter of particulars to some abstract regularity, scientific and realistic generalizations represent an attempt to save the essences. The pre-modern art of Bruegel is different, as is, I think, the unmodern modernist art of Auden and Stravinsky. Like medieval historiography, Ermarth notes, medieval painting emphasizes the discrete, discontinuous forms, and it devalues continuity or relationship between proximate instances. Ermarth concludes that such spatial discontinuity radically undermines the importance of the spectator, and in so doing, I might add, it doesn't locate the viewer in respect to Clune's objects of vision, but rather creates a sense of individual, immediate touch, one thing to one thing, outside the unworldly abstractions of law and number. In the unmodern art of Bruegel and Auden, and by modern I mean early modern, in the unmodern art of Bruegel and Auden, each image stands for itself monumentally, allegorically, in the same way a touch transforms theatrically and mimetically the immediacy of worldly experience. Look at Bruegel's painting. Icarus's legs in the water would make him half the size of the ship. The plowman is enormous in relation to the landscape. Even the setting sun, or is it the rising sun, it's hard to tell, betrays the myth of Icarus, whose wax wings were said to melt off as he climbed too close to the sun high in the sky, which in this picture seems an impossible narrative. The painting saves the appearances without creating a perspectival reality, quote-unquote reality, governing vision. I suspect that's much so-called modernist painting, from Cézanne's impossible geometries to abstractions of figure and color in cubism and abstract art, work to locate the viewer proprioceptively, immediately in the world, rather than in the abstractions of probable and improbable positions. This simply is the work of Auden's poem, in which the human position, as in pre-modern painting, is absolutely local, skating rather than waiting, so that spots are untidy, disasters are leisurely, and what is an amazing violation of the laws of nature is calmly ignored with other business at hand. That at-handness is the work of proprioception and the haptic arts I'm describing. If we look closely at Auden's poem, something its vocabulary and line lengths discourage us to do, we discover a remarkably consistent rhyme scheme. Remember the skating and waiting I mentioned a few minutes ago, which all but disappears in the colloquial enjambments of Auden's lines. I often tell my classes that if this poem were set as prose, no one would imagine there's a poem in there. This is in sharp contrast to chapter 37 of Moby Dick, in which hidden poetic language seems to sound out Shakespeare's pentameter lines. Thus, Ahab almost sings his words. These are the first sentences of chapter 37, which I've lineated. Melville doesn't do us that courtesy. Here's Ahab. I leave a white and turbid wake, pale waters, paler cheeks, where'er I sail. This envious billow sidelong swell to whelm my track, let them, but first I pass. Yonder, by ever-brimming goblets rim, the warm waves blush like wine. The gold brow plumbs the blue. The diver sun, slow dive from noon, goes down. My soul mounts up. Here Melville talks about what Auden never mentions in Bruegel, the setting sun and the rising soul. Rather, in Auden's poem, as in Bruegel's painting, everything is local, hidden, and what I might call world transcending elements are ignored in favor of worldly at-handness. Unlike Moby Dick, there's no Shakespearean tragedy hidden in Auden's lines, squares behind trapezoids. Rather, on full display, hardly hidden, are Bruegel's local and monumental truths, available to touch, one by one. Plowman, ship, drowning boy, grazing sheep. Is Bruegel's sun rising or setting? I'd say it's rising, since no one begins plowing as the night approaches. But this kind of reasoning, the inferential thinking I discussed at the medical schools this week, is literally outside the scope of pre-modern accounts of surface appearances rather than hidden laws and truths, such as the permanent rarefied number objects that, like Kant's aesthetics, transcend the world they govern. So here's a tentative conclusion, the aesthetics of worldliness. So here is a sense of the haptic arts, what I'm calling aesthetics of worldliness. I wish I had more time to study gastronomy more fully, to unpack gymnastics, to play with caricature, to demonstrate the ways that local worldliness calls upon icon, indexes, and symbols of meaning, even in Shakespeare and Melville, in Mozart's Don Giovanni, in musical gestures and what psycholinguists call mouth gestures, in the bewilderments of Beckett as well as the harmonies of Patchett. But here then is a start for thinking of aesthetics as simply a species of perception, what Vlad Glachik describes, quote, as the individual citizen in ancient Greece, indeed even women, slaves, and children, all of whom were capable of aesthesis, that is to say, perception. They encountered the worldly truths of proprioception taken in what was locally at hand, rather than rarefied senses of exteroception. But as a final tentative conclusion, can one talk that way, tentative conclusions? As a final tentative conclusion, here's another start for rethinking aesthetics. Early, I set forth an image of my dog Louis. Here is another image we saw earlier, the macaque monkeys grooming and taking care of one another. In an earlier and longer version of this talk, I had included references to Robin Dunbar's fascinating anthropological argument in his book, Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language, that contends that language became evolutionary adaptive not in order to convey information, but in order to build communities that among primates was founded upon hand-to-body contact of grooming. Thus, he argues that language developed as a way of replacing, for large cohorts of Homo sapiens, the social grooming activities of primate grooming, with a more metaphorical notion of social grooming found in gossip. Here he begins his study with a wonderful description of touching, and there are my monkeys again. He says, "A light touch," he writes, "a gentle caress can convey all the meanings in the world. One moment it can be a word of consolation, an apology, a request to be groomed, an invitation to play. Another, an assertion of privilege, a demand that you move elsewhere. On yet another, a calming influence, a declaration that intentions are friendly. Knowing which meaning to infer is the very basis of social being, depending as it does on a close reading of another's mind. In that brief moment of mutual understanding in a fast-moving, frenzied world, all social life is distilled in a single gesture." The image here is that of two macaques living and working together. You might remember I also used this image to whisper in your ear at the beginning of this presentation in my second slide, in an almost narrative visual joke. By way of professional conclusion, however, let me make a final remark on this penultimate slide in relation of the image of Louis I shared with you today. These two images feature a dog, my own dog, a daily companion, and the image of the intercourse of macaque monkeys I shared with you in the Dunbar slide and in my argument. In our interactions with non-human mammals, our interactions with non-human mammals offer, I think, a wonderful sense of worldly engagements. We know, for instance, that the very presence of service dogs improves happiness, lowers stress, and increases fitness, many of the results of engagements with the arts. Such haptic engagements, even by means of these visual images up on the screen, or by means of non-human sounds as we walk through the forest, create a sense of at-homeness and, curiously enough, haptic pleasures in the world. It is the work of the haptic arts to make us see and hear and feel these things more fully, through our clothes, our ears, through the tips of our fingers and our toes. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for that fascinating and wide-ranging lecture. If we just go to the next slide. So here is our Slido for the Q&A. So as I said before, those of you who are in the room can just put your hand up and we'll bring you a microphone. Anybody who's watching online, and if you're in the room, you can choose to do this as well. You can use the QR code, or you can go to the website and type in the code, and then you can ask your question, which we will then receive. So I can moderate the questions. We can give people a minute to gather their thoughts. Perhaps I'll start off by asking a question as the moderator's privilege. Since you've been talking about the way that the haptic operates in literature, could you say something perhaps about how the form of the material book contributes to that analysis?
The form of the book?
Yeah, material book.
Well, that's a great question. So I'll answer it, but I haven't given it much thought. But the thing about the book is that books invite us and sometimes demand that we turn pages. One of my teachers, Hugh Kenner, used to describe the difference between a scroll and a book. And in a scroll, you never know where you are. And in a book, you can always find where you are because you can find a page number of one kind or another. And that sense of having pages to be turned seems to me a remarkable way of thinking about bookishness, so to speak. But could you answer your own question better?
Disadvantage of being the moderator. And I guess the thing that I'm interested in with the material book, to use the example of the scroll and the codex that you just used, the not just not knowing where you are within the text, but not being able to jump around within the text. So for things like the Torah, where you have a regular reading per week that follows the scroll, you would have one Torah scroll that you can read from and then leave in position. But for special festivals where you're moving around within the text, you have to have a separate scroll that you can move through. And so that, like the invention of the codex and the use of the codex for the Bible allows a very different type of reading and interacting with the text for Christian scholars than the Torah makes easy. Obviously now there's that's published in book form too.
And now that you asked the question and answered so well, by the way, when Ermarth, whom I quoted, talks about the discontinuous nature of medieval art, that's particularly clear in the scroll. And the codex allows us to create relationships. One of my favorite, and Kenner, as you may know, is a scholar of Irish literature, among other things. And one of the things he describes when he's talking about this is in Ulysses, early on, I don't know the exact page, I'll make one up. Say around page 45, Leopold Bloom puts his hand in his pocket and he feels a cool, smooth object. 400 pages later, we learn that Bloom carries a potato in his pocket for good luck, to make him an Irishman. And what Kenner says is only in a book read for the second time can we make the connection between page 24 and page 468. And that kind of connection, Ermarth is suggesting, is much less accessible to the pre-modern world. And I'm interested in this in another way as well. It seems to me that the technologies of notation, writing, mathematics, whatever, aren't simply representational forms. They in fact affect what we can see. And earlier when I talked with Davis's wonderful description of mimesis as transforming rather than representing reality, he might have, or one might talk about how the connections of codexes allow us to see connections that don't simply represent the world, but to see us in a different way. I see you all smile when I mentioned he discovered a potato in his pocket. What is it? If you're reading Ulysses 15 hours later.
Questions in the room? Okay, the microphone's coming over to you so that hopefully the online audience will be able to hear the question as well.
Hi, Prof. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I'm so fascinated by all your discussions about the importance of touch, and I guess something I would like to ask. So maybe I just have like 3 quick but maybe interrelated questions. So the first thing is like I was quite fascinated by kind of your kind of theoretical approach to it, like kind of interlocuting with like semiotics and so on, and that reminded me of maybe a tradition of philosophy that I'm maybe a little bit more familiar with. I'm less familiar with semiotics, but I'm wondering like how if you are familiar and you can comment on this, like how might this relate to like the tradition of like phenomenology? Like I do wonder if like some of the things that you talk about relating to like having experienced or also going to experience, does that in any way kind of like link up to ideas in phenomenology about maybe the horizontal structure of experience? So I'm just curious, like from a very kind of broad perspective, like what do you see as some of the similarities or differences in the approach, and do you feel like the kind of way by semiotics kind of adds to that. My second question is related. I'm very curious about
Would
like,
it be easier to do one at a time? Would it be easier to do one question?
I'm happy to hear the whole.
yeah, okay.
So
So,
you're
so
talking about-
I'll just be quick, yeah. So my second question maybe is, when it comes to haptic interactions and you talk about
Well, let me
indexicality,
interrupt. So the
Sorry,
first question
yeah.
is about light, did you say?
about like phenomenology and whether or not like maybe like in your research you have kind of like interlocuted with the tradition of phenomenology in philosophy, and whether or not you can maybe speak a little bit about some of the similarities or differences to get a kind of sense of the significance or the importance of your approach through semiotic theory.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the second question is a little bit related to that. It's like the idea of haptic interactions when you talk about indexicality, that almost reminds me of like, you know, I think a lot of people in philosophy, we are quite troubled, or maybe some people, not me necessarily, are troubled by the idea that like referentiality, correspondence theory is hard to ground, and you know, like Vienna Circle and all that, the idea of like logical positivism, you know, that there seems to be problems with that. So I wonder, like, does haptic interactions, do you feel that that kind of gives us another way to think about epistemic basis, or like some idea of veracity or truthfulness that comes from what you seem to me to be kind of explaining as some very originary kind of interaction with the world? And maybe the last question is just a very quick one. Do you see any implications for like mental health or neurodiversity, like autism and ADHD? Myself, I'm somebody who is neurodiverse, so I'm very interested in that question. Ideas about differential ways of interacting with the world beyond just semiotics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. Let me see if I get it straight. The first question is about visual light. Is that what you mean? Or was it the word life?
The first question is about whether or not you have kind of in your research come across work on phenomenology, like the works of like maybe Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, whether or not you feel that there are similarities and differences between that and your approach. Yeah.
So that sounds a little like your second question as well.
Yeah, a little
Yeah. And it's a good question. I begin by quoting Kaplan's study of mathematics, because what he's trying to describe is the difference between an abstract notion of numbers as transcendental things and a phenomenological notion of numbers as something that interacts with the world. Years ago, I was writing about the square root of -1, which is one of my favorite numbers. And I went to the head of mathematics in our university to ask him what he made of that. And he said the square root of -1 is a great number because it solves a problem, certain problems. So I asked him, is that something that you invented in order to solve problems? And he was aghast. He said, no, we discovered that number. We didn't invent it. And the difference between discovering truths and inventing tools in engagement with the world is, I think, what you're asking about. And the phenomenology asks us to attend to the engagements with the world. So when I talked at the beginning, just in passing really, about speech act theory, the speech act theory, as you know, contrasts constitutive truths with what Austin calls the force of performative action. And truths are judged to be true or false. They're abstract. And force is judged to be effective or non-effective. He calls it felicitous or infelicitous. And felicitous or infelicitous is part of the world of phenomenology. I'm fascinated by the fact that phenomenology arises as a distinct science at the same time semiotics does in the late 19th century. And I believe we could talk about it, but not today, I don't think. I believe that both phenomenology and semiotics responds to the need of a consumerist culture where desire replaces need as a measure of value. When need is the measure of value, truth is easy. If you're hungry, you get food. When desire is the measure of value, should I have strawberries or chocolate? It's hard to tell. And I think in the late 19th century and in my later book about late 20th century Chinese poetry, we talk about how consumerism affects the quality of experience in a phenomenological way. Does that sort of answer your question? Thank you.
So let's take one from online first. I know there's other questions in the room. So we can start perhaps with where do you place rhythm and timbre in the schema of proprioception, exteroception, and interoception in relation to music?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I wish I had asked that question and you could answer it, whoever you are. I think I want to separate rhythm and timbre for a moment. I was going to start with rhythm, but let me start with timbre. My son, when he was growing up, played the oboe. As we all know, or as many of us know, when an orchestra tunes up, they tune to the oboe. Why do they tune to the oboe? They tune to the oboe because the oboe is most rich in overtones. Overtones are those qualities of music where when you play one note, you hear another note. The instrument that's least rich with overtones is the flute. And absolutely without overtones is the tuning fork. But it seems to me when we talk about timbre, we talk about not only the notes, but also the connotations of notes. And there's a physics to overtones, which I don't need to go into, and that probably wouldn't be particularly accurate. But it seems to me that that kind of physics of overtones matches up with my notion of worldly haptics. We have, as I said about my dog Louis, you can train him to salivate when we play the note D. When we play it in the course of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, his mouth stays dry. And the reason it's been suggested, it makes sense to me, is that the quality of the experience is different, even though the wavelength measure of the sound is not different. And I think what timbre does is brings sounds back to the world. Adorno, in one of his essays about music, writes that it boggled my mind, to tell you the truth. He says, when I listen to Beethoven or read his score, I have such and such experience. And I couldn't imagine what the hell he was talking about. How could reading a score have the same quality of experience of listening to music? And I suppose if he's sensitive to music in a way that he hears the notes when he reads the scores, which I don't, that's why I was amazed, he can do that. But when he's describing, it seems to me that opposition is part of this question. And insofar as timbre is complicated this way, it seems to me it's proprioceptive. Rhythm is also interesting. Where does rhythm come from? Levi-Strauss I forget where, talks about the nature of rhythm in music in the Ron the Cook. And he talks about how rhythm comes from two systems. It comes from the biological system of our heartbeat and the cultural system of the musical, he doesn't use the word, the musical semiotics we live in. And it's the contrast between the consistency of biology and the difference of cultural formations that I'm trying to talk about. Because once you have that kind of difference, I'm looking at the questioner, once you have that kind of difference, rhythm can become proprioceptive. And Levi-Strauss describes wonderfully how rhythms give you a sense of falling and a sense of rising. He might have been describing Denison's ballet dancer when he describes the way that musical rhythms work. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what comes to mind.
Now another question from the room.
Thank you so much, Professor. it's I have a rather rhizomic question, if I may. I have no idea where to begin or where to end, but I'm really interested in how you might extrapolate upon this. I'm not a professor of aesthetics. I'm a professor of cinema, which is like the world's answer to bastardizing all aesthetics. So I want to ask, and please forgive me that I'm kind of extrapolating from your approach today in some of my current research. Mila Zuo, in her book Vulgar Beauty, talks about the etymology of the word beauty in the Chinese language as coming from a sense of taste. So we literally taste it, as you're suggesting. Haptic arts allow us to touch. And what I'm wondering is, given how much reference to Kant you have made, whether you see the Kantian notion of judgment coming before experience of beauty as being contradictory to what you're saying about the haptic arts, or what Mila Zuo is suggesting of the cinematic experience of perceiving beauty.
It's a wonderful question.
Cool.
And if we were alone, I'd ask you to answer it, but I better try myself. First of all, I like the idea of taste. I mentioned gastronomy in passing, and I need to learn more about this. Well, one of the questions is what makes me come back to NTU, and what I've done over the years is I've come here and given the first version of some long-term chapter, and when I go home, I simply know more. When I was writing about economics, I met a business major here, and he asked a question like yours, which made me rethink everything. And I think you might do that as well. So
do I get a citation then?
More than that, I think I'll give you an outward thank you at the beginning, but I need to get your name. Or thanks to the pleasant but anonymous person. I don't know much about taste. My vague sense is that the sensors in our mouths are very limited: bitter, salt, sweet. I think there are 4, but I can't remember them all. What are they?
I forget. It's bitter, salt, sweet. But Zuo bases her whole book on a chapter dedicated to each, and I know that there are 5 chapters.
But the numbers of tastes are far beyond 5. You know, and it seems to me, and I don't know this. This is what the future will bring. But it seems to me, one of the reasons I can argue that taste is proprioceptive is because it makes its judgment not by immediate sensation but by interaction. You know, and so the many tastes we have when we eat might be based on these 5 sensations, but I don't think they're grounded in them. I think they exfoliate from them. And to your Kantian question, it seems to me that Kant and the Enlightenment in general, as Erdmar says, is seeking the basic laws of the world. When Kaplan says the number 3 becomes rarefied, he wants a basic thing. And Lord knows that way of thinking has made the world better in lots of ways. It's made the world worse in lots of ways. But the Enlightenment, as Bruno Latour says, has a double legacy of oppression and freedom. It's a strange combination. And it seems to me that the law-like nature that Kant is seeking, because he imagines, I think properly, that laws are liberating, also reduces things. And the reduction is what you described, is making judgment precede experience, which, when we think of our lives, doesn't make sense, you know, and yet he's convinced us that it does. And one of the things I think the haptic arts demand that we do is to rethink that, so that experience and worldly experience comes first. So I hope that starts to answer your question.
Yeah, very, very much. I'm glad that you brought it back to Irmath again, because I was fascinated by that comment of hers about discontinuity. Sorry, I've got it. Spatial discontinuity radically undermining the spectator. because the sensorial approach to cinema that Zuo takes, which is entirely anti-Kantian, actually places the spectator as a much more engaged and co-creator in the experience on screen. So,
and in fact, I love that quote from Impressionist art that I mentioned, which demands active absorption, because it demands that the spectator participate in the experience that the artwork seems to be provoking, and it seems to me that that's the measure of the haptic arts. You know, as Kramlich says, when we bump into something, we start asking what's its distance from our hand, and that sense of that's what I mean by worldliness. Is that kind of distancing? Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We can maybe take another one from online. So, have you consulted empirical studies in your work beyond the theoretical? And the questioner asks or adds, I wonder, since medical humanities offers opportunities for practical application.
Oh.
So maybe you can relate that either to the talk that you've just given or perhaps your more general work.
That's a great question, and it leaves me a little quiet because I'm trying to remember. I guess my first response, which might not be fair, I usually try to be fair, by the way, is that the opposition between empirical and theoretical might be present assumptions to begin with. How to answer this? When I thought at first that the first question was about light, I was going to come back to I mentioned just in passing 3 kinds of definition: the exemplary, the Aristotelian, and the last kind of definition is operational. Operational definition grew out of Einstein's work. Einstein asks, how do we define simultaneous? And the answer is the train comes into the station and we see the clock is 3 o'clock. And he goes on to say that we can ask, what's the speed of light? Since it's finite, and if the clock is far enough away, is it really 3 o'clock when the train comes in? And what he's trying to do is to describe a functional definition. And it seems to me that the opposition between empirical and theoretical leaves out the functional in a certain way, which sounds, and properly does sound like a fudge. So the real answer to this question would be, I need to go do some more homework, which I'm happy to do.
Are there any more questions in the room? Yes, we can maybe close with a final question from online. So a questioner who's asking you to clarify, perhaps expand on the relationship between impossible perspectives and the haptic arts.
Well, my immediate response, I wish this person was here to correct me. My immediate response is that the perspectives from the haptic are never impossible. That the relation between my hand and that chair is always possible. And it seems to me that proprioception, well, as soon as you think about it, proprioception is what? It's those sensations that animate creatures have, not only mammals, I emphasize mammals, animate creatures have of where they're located in space. If you don't know that, you're not going to last very long. And that sense of knowing where you are has to be always possible. Or I shouldn't say always possible. If you don't know where you are, then you are lost. And maybe that might answer the second part of this, which is practical applications in medicine. One of the most interesting things I came across in the last number of years in studying the medical humanities is a wonderful article and then a book by a doctor named Eric Cassell called The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine. I don't know if you all know it. You should go out and read it. It's quite good. And what he argues is that the nature of suffering is well defined, but by finding yourself situated in a place where there is no future, that your future is somehow taken away from you. And he has a long list of 13 qualities of being a person, one of which is having a future, the other of which, I could go through them, they're fun. But the point is that in relation to this question is what he's describing as suffering as being in the impossible, what's the word that they use? The impossible perspective of not knowing where you are. And what the haptics do is locate us in the world. Do they always work? No. I mean, people do suffer. But the point is, it seems to me, let me see the question again. Clarify impossible perspectives. Impossible perspectives are the perspectives of the Kantian laws. The place where you have to sit to see squares on Raphael's painting. And you can't sit there because we don't fly. The haptics put us in the world where we have to figure out where we were. It's always calculating, but it's always possible. And part of the part of the work of medicine, I think, and this isn't always possible, but it's more possible than we think. The work of medicine is to give people a sense of possibilities that they thought were lost to them. I'll just finish with this is the last question. In a wonderful study of pain and suffering by Melanie Thurston, she talks about how I'm talking all about dogs today. She talks about how experiments have taught dogs to not resist their own pain. They gave dogs a shock over and over again, and then they put these dogs in a position where they can get away from the shocking, and 3/4 of them didn't take the opportunity to relieve their own suffering. They just sat there in pain. But she goes on to say that 1/4 of them did. 25% of these dogs who were trained to suffer discovered that there was a possibility of not suffering. And it seems to me one of the things the health care work can do is teach people to abandon learned suffering, is what they call this. And we can't teach everybody. But if we teach 25%, we're doing the world a favor. And I hadn't thought about this before. Her images are dogs in a cage, and the cage is reconfigured so they can escape. That reconfiguration is haptic, where they can find a new location for themselves in the world, and they all don't do it. It's 75% moan and groan, but the other 25% have discovered a possible future which they thought was lost to them. So that might answer that question.
Thank you very much. So unless there are any final questions from the room? No? In that case, please join me in saying a final thank you to Professor Schleifer for a fascinating and wide-ranging lecture that I'm sure we'll all continue to think about over the next few days, few hours. Thank you very much.
Great questions.